Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. In the name of Allah, the gracious, ever merciful. Peace and blessings of Allah be upon you, dear viewers. Welcome to tonight's lecture organized by the UK Talim Department. As per our tradition, we will start the program with the recitation of the Holy Quran. Can I ask Muhammad Yasir Sahib to deliver the tilawat and the translation?
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.
وعليكم السلام.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الذين يقولون ربنا إننا آمنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وقنا عذاب النار الصابرين والصادقين والقانتين والمنفقين والمستغفرين بالأسحار شهد الله أنه لا إله إلا هو والملائكة وأولو العلم قائما بالقسط لا إله إلا هو العزيز الحكيم. Translation: Surah Al-Imran, verse 17 to 19. Those who say, Our Lord, we do believe, forgive us, therefore our sins, and save us from the punishment of the fire. The steadfast and the truthful, and the humble, and those who spend in the way of God, and those who seek forgiveness in the latter part of the night. Allah bears witness that there is no God but He, and also do the angels and those possessed of knowledge, maintainer of justice. There is no God but He, the Mighty, the Wise. Jazakumullah.
Jazakallah. Tonight we have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Sanda Ismail Sahib, who obtained his Bachelor of Science degree in Community Nutrition at the University for Development Studies in Ghana. He has later completed his Master's and PhD degrees at the University of West of England, Bristol. He specializes in applied epidemiology and understanding statistics in public health. Sanda is currently a senior lecturer in public health at the University of West of England, Bristol. He leads several modules on the MSc Public Health program. He is the module leader for quantitative health research and leadership for public health. His research interests spans across several areas, including aging and dementia, evaluation of community projects to promote health and well-being. As always, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. These questions will be put to our guests on your behalf in the last 15 minutes. Please type your questions to the relevant topic in the live chat. It gives me a great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Sanda Ismail Sahib.
Jazakallah. So I'll just try and share my screen now. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم I would like to first of all greet you all with the usual Islamic salutation of greeting. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So, as I've been rightly introduced, I work in the field of public health, and basically what public health means, it is the study of how diseases and health conditions affect people, in populations, in groups and societies. So the study of public health is beyond the individual, it looks at populations. The key principles of public health is on prevention, okay? So how we can actually prevent diseases from impacting on human beings in communities, in societies, in nations, and globally. One of the other key dimension of public health is social justice, how we can actually bridge that inequality and health among and between different groups within our society. So the title of my lecture today is Understanding the Impact of COVID-19 on BAME Groups in the UK. So, well, yes, another talk on COVID. But this takes quite a unique and different dimension. This is a very complex topic and a very politically controversial one. And I shall try my best to touch on the key aspects of it within the time frame that we have for this lecture. This is a topic that is also quite emotionally sensitive. And before I go into any details about my lecture, I would like to first of all apologize to our viewers whom discussions on any aspect of this topic that's on COVID may evoke any emotions, because it is very possible that a lot of us have either ourselves been impacted by COVID, our relatives or our friends, be it the health impact of COVID, be it the socio-economic aspect of COVID as well. So my apologies in advance. Just to say, for those who first here in the UK, if you're seeking advice and guidance on any aspect related to COVID, including the latest rules and regulations regarding containment and lockdowns, please visit the government's website. That is the source of any authentic information that you need around COVID in the United Kingdom. I have actually organized this presentation into three main themes. So first of all, it's just an introduction to give you an overview of what the pandemic is, of the different pandemics that we've had in history, and also just briefly touch upon COVID-19, something that I am very sure you are all aware of, and to also define who we refer to when we talk about BAME, that's Black, Asian, Minority Ethnic Groups. I also talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on mortality in the UK. By mortality, I mean death. And also, we'll then go into the crust of the presentation itself, into how ethnicity has been found as a risk factor to COVID-19, and why ethnicity is actually a risk factor to COVID-19 death or mortality. Just a brief overview of what a pandemic is. So the word pandemic actually originates from the Greek language, and where pan means all and demos means people, like demography. So pandemic literally means something that affects everybody, irrespective of the country that you're living in, the region that you're in, you were affected by that health condition or that disease. Pandemics are not a new thing in human history. We've been living with pandemics for a very long time. Some come and go, some come and stay. The duration with which some stay, they vary, and the damage that they cause before some live, they also do vary. Right from the times where there were things such as the Black Death in the 13th century, right to more recent ones that most people may be familiar with, things such as yellow fever, HIV/AIDS, Asian flu, Hong Kong flu, MERS, SARS, Ebola, swine flu, and now COVID. and that is the current pandemic that has actually found its place in the spotlight of everything else that we do. This is just a diagram that sort of illustrates the number of deaths that various pandemics have claimed over time. And as you can see, the Black Death in the 13th century was one of the most fatal pandemics that we've seen so far, claiming over 200 million lives. And you can see that number sort of, in sort of descending order. And we then have COVID over here. COVID, just to mention, already it's claimed more lives than most past pandemics that we've seen, but it's still not over. It's still claiming lives. And that is what makes it really, really threatening. Okay. So what is COVID? I'm not going to bore you with what COVID is, as I believe all of us now are very familiar with what COVID is. But as we all know, it is a disease that is caused by a particular kind of virus known as coronavirus. Just the only thing I want to say about this is that it's a virus, which means that it is one of the most notorious germs that we have. So compared to other bacteria, viruses are quite difficult to deal with. They keep changing a lot, and before we think we understand them, before we think we're about to control them, they change to other forms. So very notorious. Just to say,
just to let you know, we can only see the first slide.
Oh,
Sorry.
right. That's okay. So I may have to, do I have to resume the sharing again?
Now we can see your next slide. So what is COVID-19?
Okay. If I put it back into slideshow mode, do you see the current slide now?
Yes, overview of pandemics.
I'm just going to try and move to the next slide, whether that works. Did anything change in your view?
No, I'm afraid not.
Okay, so it means the slideshow isn't working. So maybe I'll just leave it in the PowerPoint. And so if I go to the next slide, can you see what it is?
Yes.
If I move next, can you see the next one?
Yes, we can.
Okay, absolutely. So I'm just going to leave it in PowerPoint mode. For some reason, when I run the slideshow on the full screen, it doesn't sort of project on your end. Okay. I'm not going to, I wouldn't repeat what I've said, but these were the pictures that I was talking about. Sorry, unfortunately, you couldn't see these beautiful diagrams, but here they are in terms of the history of pandemics that we've had so far. And then coming to the number of lives that these pandemics have claimed. And this was trying to show where COVID is in terms of the ranking, already beating a lot of pandemics, but it's still ongoing. Okay. And I was just talking about what COVID is. Now, just the other thing I want to add on this slide is that the best means is prevention. Okay, so you've had all the regular messages. Please stick to them. Wash your hands with soap and clean water. At the moment, we are in lockdown in the UK, in England, and in various parts of the UK, and in Wales and Scotland as well. Only go out when it's essential. If you do go out, maintain your social distancing and, keep to those regular messages. Now, in terms of who do we refer to when we say BAME? Okay, BAME is an acronym which stands for Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic Groups. It's an acronym that is used in the UK to describe people from these ethnic groups. Now, you may have come across similar terms such as BME, and that's Black Minority Ethnic Groups, or Black and Ethnic Minority, that's BEM. Various terms have been used to describe these ethnic groups. There are some controversies in terms of the use of this term. Some people feel that it is labeling. So some people actually prefer to just to refer to all these terms as ethnically diverse communities. What they all mean is that it just means someone who is not white. Okay, anybody who is not white actually belongs to this category. Okay, in terms of the representation of BAME groups in the UK, so the estimated population of the UK for England and Wales is around 56 million. And out of this, we have the BAME, the BAME groups represent, the rest really of the 86%. Okay, so that's about 14% of the UK population. And I've just shown the breakdown of these various ethnic groups in terms of their proportion on the slide. And there's a diagram on my right-hand side illustrating that. So sorry, you cannot see all the fancy animations I've put on my slide over here. But I now want to move on to talk about the impacts that COVID-19 has had on the UK in general before I focus on BAME groups. And just to say that the analysis that I will be showing you and the results are from these 3 key reports over here. Anyone who wants to know more about what I'm talking about, these reports are freely available online. Do have a read, about them if you want more information. So, in terms of death in general from COVID-19 in the UK, what we do have is that the best way to actually compare countries, okay, is to look at the deaths that sort of occurred, when we started experiencing COVID in significant amounts compared to the years before. Okay, normally we compare it 5 years before. And if you look at all deaths, okay, that's including COVID and non-COVID, between January and June 2020, compared to the average number of deaths 5 years before this time, you can see that England is not doing very well over here, okay? Irrespective of gender, and whether you're male or female, the risk of death is very, very high between this period compared to 5 years ago. Scotland is not very different. Wales is not doing any better compared to other European countries, and the same with Northern Ireland. So there is a big problem in the UK when it comes to death from COVID. Okay. And it's, again, apologies, you can't see all my fancy animations, but there are, various risk factors, if you like, and risk factors just means reasons, contributing to the death from COVID, okay? And from the research that we have so far, these are some of the key factors that have been found to be associated with death from COVID, okay? One of them is, the health condition, the previous health conditions of people, deprivation of the area that they live. When I talk about deprivation, we mean poverty, how poor, in terms of the area that they live in relation to income, occupation, and the environment. Their living conditions, and this basically means how overcrowded they do live in housing and the housing conditions in which they live in. Living in particular regions also is a risk factor to dying from COVID in the UK. It depends, and depending on the kind of employment that you do, you are also at risk based on the data that we have. And you can see that ethnicity is a big factor, and that's what we're going to talk about, for the rest of this lecture. And you can see that, it's alarming. Why is it that just belonging to an ethnic group just makes you at a higher risk of dying from COVID? That is a problem, okay? That is a big problem, a big concern. There is something that I'll touch upon, which is very interesting in my opinion, which is religion. Religion being a risk factor to COVID. And, I'll talk more about that. There are some interesting things when it comes to that. So just to tell you the extent to which BAME, different ethnic groups are impacted by COVID. And the graph on my right just shows you the extent, the amount of death from COVID, for male and female based on different ethnicities. You can see that for Black African, they've got the highest risk of dying from COVID, followed by Bangladeshi, Black Caribbean, and Pakistani, other ethnic groups, Indian, and so on and so forth. And you can see that all these ethnicities have got higher risk of dying compared to white males. The situation is not different for females. The only difference now is that those at higher risk are Black Caribbean, followed by Pakistani women, Black African women, Bangladeshi women, Indian women, and you can see the ranking on the graph. So, big gap in terms of the death based on ethnicity due to COVID. Okay. Now, So, but that's a wrong spelling of mortality. Just correct that. So now, I'd like us to talk about why is this the case? Why is ethnicity a risk factor? Why is it that, identifying yourself as a particular ethnic group in the UK makes you at higher risk of dying from COVID? Let us see why. Before we get into the nitty-gritties of why, it is very important that for us to really understand why, we need to start viewing COVID from various lenses or from various perspectives, if you like. So when COVID hit, the world, what you ended up hearing was the biological aspect of COVID, okay? So there were lots of biological modeling as to how many waves it was going to take. Everything was very biological. Everything was medical. And I'm sure you heard in the news things such as R numbers, determining the severity of COVID in places, and containment measures were all based on these R numbers. So a very biological, perspective. But that is a very narrow perspective if you're looking at, a disease such as COVID. Because the health of people is not only impacted by their biology, it's impacted by everything else around them. Okay, it's impacted by their income, their employment, the kind of housing that they live in as well. So there are broad elements that impact on people's health beyond just their biological makeup. That makes us start thinking that COVID is not just a pandemic. In fact, it is what we describe in technical terms as a syndemic. Syndemic just means that it is an interaction between both biological and social ecological factors that are sort of contributing to the severity of this particular disease. It's interesting, the syndemic is not a new term. It wasn't coined when COVID came around. It's been used way in the 1990s. But it's interesting that many people did not actually see COVID that way. And that's the sort of perspective I'm going to take throughout this presentation to explain why BAME groups are more impacted by COVID. Okay, so when we start seeing diseases from that kind of socio-ecological broad perspective, we tend to see that COVID may actually be a result of a social crisis, okay, than just viewing it as as a biological problem. I've just put this diagram here, and this is from the World Health Organization, just to show how COVID sort of impacts on people, and it tries to explain why certain groups will be more impacted by COVID than others. And three different mechanisms, all based on the color of the arrow. So if we focus on the green one, just quickly, it just says that what COVID does is that it impacts on people, but it impacts on them unequally. So people with underlying health conditions will be more impacted than those who are relatively healthy. What that means is that in society, we are already living with that gap, okay? We already have a gap in society. For example, you have some extreme people who are extremely rich, others who are extremely poor, others who are extremely healthy, others who are extremely unhealthy. What COVID does is that it just widens that gap further. So those who are poorer in health, poorer in income, are dying more of COVID than their counterpart. But another thing also occurs over here. When various countries, including the UK, tried controlling COVID, what we ended up hearing was things such as lockdowns. Okay, certain occupations, people being laid off, people being furloughed, and schools being closed, only allowing certain groups of people to send their children to school. Unfortunately, what happens is that, that in itself disproportionately affects certain groups of people in our society already, okay? And that goes to widen that inequality that already exists in our society, okay? So this is just a diagram just to simplify the process. I'll now go into a bit more detail and focus more on the UK context. So one of the biggest risk factors that we found that contributes to high mortality from COVID-19 is actually deprivation. And by deprivation, it just means poverty, okay? So taking into consideration things such as income, employment, health, crime, housing, and your living environment. And it is found that the more, deprived, if you live in a more deprived area, okay, that is deprived in all these aspects that I've mentioned, you're more likely, to die compared to others from less deprived areas anyway. And for COVID, you're also more likely to die from COVID. and also from non-COVID causes. Okay, and you can see that if you look at the graph, the less the less deprived you are, or if you live in a least deprived area, the lesser your chances of dying from COVID. And this is for males, and a similar picture is for females. Okay. There's a slideshow just to show how this sort of reflects on BAME groups. But since the slideshow is not working, I'm not going to go into that. But what we do realize is that people from BAME background are actually more likely to live in more deprived areas. Okay, and that perhaps is one of the things that is explaining why some BAME groups or BAME groups are more impacted by COVID than their counterpart white population. Oh, yes, that graph is actually here. So you can see that for different ethnicities compared to the white population, if we take males, for example, you can see the stark difference in mortality. Okay, so the different colors represent the extent of deprivation. The darker one means most deprived, and the light green ones means least deprived. And if you take any of the bars and compare it to the white population, it's extremely high for all the BAME groups. Okay, and that's the same for females. But the interesting thing here is, even if you take a particular ethnic group, like the Black population, for example, even within that group, those who live in least deprived areas, which is the light green, have less mortality from COVID compared to those who actually live in more or most deprived areas. So living in a poor neighborhood in itself puts you at risk from dying from COVID. Okay, and as I said, most BAME communities lived in deprived areas in the UK. So deprivation is a factor. Another factor is overcrowding. Okay, it's been found that local authorities where there is higher rates of overcrowding have actually got more COVID deaths. Now let us focus on the graph on our left for now. Okay, where you realize that I've just circled two local authorities here, Brent and Newham. Okay, this graph, the axis here shows the level of overcrowding, and the one here shows the death from COVID-19. Now, the more a local authority is placed here, the greater the extent of overcrowding on average. So you can see that Brent and Newham are high in terms of overcrowding, and that corresponds to the level of COVID-19 deaths from these areas. Now, since we're focusing on ethnicity, let us see the proportion of BAME groups living in Brent and Newham. If you look at Brent, 65% of that population is made up of BAME groups. Okay, so it's made up of Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups. And for Newham, it is 72%. Okay, so one of the factors that is explaining the excess amount of death from COVID-19 among BAME groups is overcrowding and housing. Okay, the data clearly shows that. Let us go to another risk factor. So another risk factor, that sort of predisposes people to risk of dying from COVID is underlying health conditions and disability. And you can see from this graph, okay, so this is general. This includes everybody in the UK, for males and females. Just to explain, this age adjusted and adjusted this means it has controlled for other factors. Okay, if you look at it, the more if you're disabled or if you have an underlying health condition, you're more at risk of dying from COVID. Okay, and this is for females, the first two that you see, and these two are for males. Whether you're male or female, underlying health conditions makes you at higher risk. The risk is higher for females compared to males. Okay, one of the reasons for this is because females in the UK relatively have a higher life expectancy, and they do live longer than males. So they have a higher risk of underlying health conditions than males. Now let us come back to the BAME group. What we do know from statistics is that the BAME groups are at higher risk of underlying health conditions such as diabetes, heart and circulatory diseases, and obesity compared to the white population. And that may therefore be the factor explaining why some BAME groups are at higher risk of dying from COVID than the white population. And I've put the statistics over here. South Asians, 6 times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes, African Caribbean, up to 5 times. African Caribbean at higher risk of high blood pressure and stroke. South Asians more likely to develop coronary disease. Black adults more likely to be obese. Okay, so that sort of explains, some of it. These are small numbers, but an interesting piece of research done by the TfL Transport Company in London. Looking at, so there are drivers that died from COVID-19, and they sort of analyzed this by ethnicity. And what they did find is that, so among their Asian drivers that died of COVID, 8 of them actually had one or more underlying health conditions, okay, out of the 9 drivers that died. For Black people, out of the 11 drivers that died, 3 of them had one or more underlying health conditions. And for the white drivers that died, 5 of them had one or more underlying health conditions. So having underlying chronic health conditions, is one of the factors that explains why BAME communities are more impacted by COVID-19 mortality compared to their white counterparts. So interesting statistics. Another risk factor that has been found is occupation. So it is found that people whose job actually requires them to be close to other people are at higher risk of dying from COVID-19. And of course, it is very obvious, isn't it? The closer you are to people, the chances of you actually being infected and transmitting the viruses between and among each other. And then, of course, once you have the virus, then your risk of dying from it is higher. Okay? If we focus on the graph on the left for a minute, this shows occupations where the proximity or the closeness to others is really small. So these are occupations that people are very, very close to other people. And you can see that on top of that list here, you find occupations such as security guards, taxi drivers and chauffeurs, care workers, nursing assistants, chefs and nurses. Okay, I've just pulled out just 2 of these occupations at the higher rank. Okay, and it shows that security guards are at higher risk of dying from COVID-19, and taxi drivers and chauffeurs are as well, just because of the proximity they have with other human beings. Now, let us just take these 2, and I've highlighted it in red and blue. And let's focus on the graph on the right. The graph on the right just tells us how much, of this occupation group are made up of BAME people. You can see that, so this line here shows the percentage of the workforce that are BAME. So if you take security guards, you have over 32% of that population workforce being made of BAME groups. And if you take taxi drivers, you've actually got over 43%, okay, coming from BAME backgrounds. This partly then explains why the mortality from COVID is higher among BAME groups. Now let us move on. So we're now unpacking the risk factors over here. So you can start, we started seeing things like occupation, poverty, and overcrowding and all that. Now let us move on. This is a very interesting slide. And what the data shows is that actually identifying yourself to subscribe to a particular religious faith, if you look at it on a whole, seems to make you more at risk of dying from COVID. Now, we need to explain this graph properly, and it's very interesting. There's a lot of things that I think are sort of unpicked from this graph, and it's divided. It's presented for both males and females. The difference is not very huge for both. But the graph shows that if you look at the green bar over here, okay, if the green bar pushes more to the right, it means you are at higher risk of dying, and that corresponds to the faith that you subscribe to over here. Okay, and this line just shows that if it crosses this line, you are more than 2 times, likely to die from COVID, just because you belong to a particular religion. The light green bars shows that they've controlled for age. Okay, so if you don't account for age, it means that if you have one group that has got more older people, then the death automatically will be higher. So you need to control for it. So age is not an explanatory factor. So when they controlled for only age, it appeared that if you're a Muslim man, you are actually more than 2 times, likely to die from COVID compared to a Christian man. If you're a Muslim woman, you are still very close to 2 times more likely to die from COVID compared to a Christian woman. So this is just controlling for age. Okay, what about when they took into account ethnicity? Okay, because if you look at religion, most people who subscribe to religions are from BAME groups, okay, or who are committed to religious practices are from BAME groups. So when we take into account ethnicity, we now have to focus on the dark green bars, okay, for each religious group. What we do realize is that when we account for ethnicity, the risk is reduced. In fact, for male Muslims, there isn't the risk between them, and male Christians, there is no difference. Controlling for ethnicity among women, there is also no difference. In fact, it looks as if you're a Muslim woman, you are actually more protective of dying from COVID-19 than if you were a Christian woman, although the difference is not significant from these bars. If you look at for Hindus, similar pattern, okay, for males and females. But for the Jewish sect, even after controlling for ethnicity, the risk is still higher, okay, for both male and female. Then the rest of the religious group, you have similar patterns to that of the Muslims and the Hindus. Now, very interesting explanation here. Why? So this tells us that, ethnicity plays a huge part when it comes to, mortality death. And it's not just about religion. It's about the various ethnic groups that subscribe to the religions that they practice. Okay, so that's very interesting. And as a Muslim, it makes me interested. I want to explore this further. So why is it that, being a Muslim does not make you, at risk of dying from COVID, but it's actually the ethnicity that you bring to the religion? Is this a question that we are practicing more of our ethnic practices and cultural practices than our religious practices? It's a big question that I've thrown out there to audience to discuss and debate among themselves. But that's a very interesting thing to explore. Just coming towards the end, so I have shown how various factors, such as occupation, conditions of living, religion, and all that, and poverty, explain why BAME groups are likely to die from COVID-19 compared to white population. There are other factors that have been found. Okay, so things to do with structural racism. Okay, so for a very long time this has been realized, but COVID has come to reveal it. The UK society is now realizing that some of the structures that they've put in place in employment, in education, in health, in the community, automatically just do not allow BAME groups to benefit from those social structures, what we call social capital. Okay, and usually deals with things like, it's not an intentional thing. Okay, it's not an intentional thing. For example, I'm from the higher education sector, and we see things such as, for example, for certain courses, maybe the reading list or the books they tell students to read are all written by people from white or European background. And maybe their perspective is from that angle. So that automatically discriminates BAME students who will be in a class like that. These are not intentional, but these have an impact. And realize that, things like that within our society actually has an impact on the BAME group. And that sort of explains why BAME groups are dying more from COVID. And things about discrimination, which is a big problem. And one of the sectors that this was found is the health sector. So, it's been uncovered that, BAME groups who were frontline workers in the health industry were actually not provided with the appropriate PPE. That's a big shame, okay? And that's something that is being worked on so that it doesn't happen in the future. Things to do with decent housing. BAME groups are less likely to actually own a house in the UK. And, and in terms of the housing conditions, the overcrowding and the quality of the housing, that all has an impact on their health. And that has come to explain why they are more affected by COVID. An interesting slide over here, just coming towards the end. when actually in the research, when they identified all these factors that I've talked about, employment, your living conditions, poverty, deprivation of your neighborhood, religion, and all that, and they controlled for all that. So when you control for them in research, what it means is that when you take them away, are BAME groups still at risk? And this includes things like racism and discrimination. And when they did that, what this graph actually shows that the risk is still there. They took all those away in the analysis. And it still showed that BAME groups are still at higher risk of dying from COVID. What this means is that there isn't any single risk factor that can explain, the reason why BAME groups are at higher risk of dying from COVID. It is cumulative. That means, one factor adds to the other, it adds to the other one, adds to the other one, and keeps on increasing the risk. So if you look at the data that I've presented so far, what it shows is that, so if you're a Black male and have underlying health conditions, and you're working in one of the risky occupations that I've shown, and you live in a poor neighborhood, and you live in an overcrowded house, you are at a very high risk of dying from COVID. Compared to other people outside these aspects. So it's not just one risk factor. So when we're thinking about controlling this, we should think about not just focusing on one aspect. So not just on occupation or employment, or not just on house, or not just on health. We need to take into account all these factors to be able to control for it. One of the things that really caught my attention was how religion actually seems to be a protective factor, really, but the risk actually comes from the ethnicity, and that's a very important thing. And I think that actually makes religious communities play a vital role when it comes to promoting the health of people, especially when it comes to actually containing COVID in our societies. I think religious organizations play a very key role. And as an Ahmadi Muslim, I can sort of see the things that our community does, and how that sort of impacts or potentially sort of impact or can help control things like that. And not just only the Ahmadiyya community, but other religious communities in the UK as well. I just want to highlight on this slide that aside, what COVID has come to cause, the inequalities it has caused, the measures we're currently using to control it are actually making BAME communities more affected. So if people have to stop working or lose their jobs, and these are actually people in certain occupations and in certain ranks of those occupations. So you have people in directorship and management roles who can work from home, and they don't have to lose their jobs. But people who are the lower rank when it comes to employment, and this is where you find a lot of BAME groups, can't work. So that means, or they can't actually get the necessary help that they need from government, and they have to work. And by working, what it means is that they are putting themselves at risk. The lockdown rules didn't take care into things like this. It was just looking at our numbers, where the cases are more. But it should have looked into detail which groups are more affected, and to proportionately sort of distribute these containment measures, especially the vaccinations as well. It needed to take into consideration these particular groups as also in the containment measures. Else what it does is that it just keeps on widening the inequality. A couple of slides more to go. Some other views is that these inequalities are already there in our society, and there is evidence to show that the inequalities that were experienced 10 years ago in the UK have actually worsened. They've not improved over 10 years, despite everything that has been done. It's actually widened, and COVID has just come to unravel that, or actually woken us up towards it. So in conclusion, I think COVID is both a pandemic, it affects everyone, irrespective of who you are, where you come from in the world. It will affect you, but I also believe that it is a social crisis in terms of, although it affects everyone, it affects people differently, and some groups have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. To understand how it affects, those particular groups, I think we need to, it helps us to understand the underlying or pre-existing inequalities that are already there in our society. So COVID didn't create them. These are there, but what they have caused is that they've made the impact from COVID worse. And I think when we're thinking about distributing resources to contain COVID, we need to do them proportionately. So not necessarily equally, but proportionately according to those who are more affected. And I'll just reiterate this point again. I think faith and religious group has got a very vital role to play when it comes on, bridging that inequality gap and the impact of COVID on BAME communities. Okay, not only COVID, but beyond that. Okay. I hope you found the session useful. Thank you very much, and Jazakallah for listening.
Jazakallah, Dr. Ismail Sahib, for such a comprehensive lecture on a specialist subject. I'm certain the viewers would appreciate the relation of epidemic and BAME communities from various angles. I mean, your research and statistics certainly provide an insight of many factors, like deprivation is one of them, and how linking into the religion and the community's culture. As you have mentioned, any update with regards to COVID-19 guidance, people should visit the government website, which is the www.gov.uk/coronavirus. Right, it's time for question and answer. So I would now pass on to Waqar Ahmadi Sahib.
Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Sahib, I'm going to go straight into it. We've got lots of questions from our viewers, mashallah, who've been very engaged, but also I think slightly worried as well by some of the data. So I'll just go through the questions one by one with your permission. We have a question from Shah Jahan Ahmad Sahib, who says that you've obviously mentioned in your lecture that the BAME community is more vulnerable due to various factors, and they have underlying health conditions as well. But he says that it's also been observed that those who die from COVID are also very fit and healthy, regardless of color and creed. Can you please account for that?
Yes, absolutely. So you realize that when I towards the end of my lecture, I said that there isn't any single risk factor that can explain why BAME communities are dying more from COVID. So underlying health conditions is only one of the factors, okay? There are other things such as deprivation. There are other things such as occupation. Okay, there are other things, such as housing conditions and the nature of your environment as well. So it's possible that someone will be healthy, doesn't have underlying conditions, but the person may be exposed to all the other risk factors that I've just pointed out.
Jazakallah. There's another couple of questions that were asking about why the UK, or maybe Europe specifically, has the highest mortality rate in the world in comparison with other parts of the globe, such as in South America, perhaps, or even Africa, where there might be overcrowding, but we don't hear of as many rates. So again, is there an explanation for that?
Well, so when you mentioned Africa, you put a smile on my face. And it's in terms of the comparison, why? So there's a joke about this, but there's some bit of truth that there is an African country that actually said they didn't record any case of COVID so far, and they asked them why. I think it's somewhere Burundi or so. I don't know how true this joke is, but they asked them, why haven't you recorded any case? They say because we don't test people. Okay, so there is the point I'm making here is in terms of comparison, I think we always need to be very careful when we're comparing between different places, because one of them is whether we have good data in those countries in the first place. Okay, so if you think about Africa, if you think about Pakistan, for example, the way they sort of gather data is very different to the way people gather data in Europe, okay, for example. And maybe they are not testing more, and that's why I think, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but I think he has a point when he says, don't blame me as the president of US of having high cases because I'm testing more. Okay, so this is just to say we need to be careful when we're comparing regions. So the other point as to why even in Europe, some countries are seeing, higher impact. I mean, there were so many perspectives to this, okay? There are things to do with one of the key things, and I am saying this because this is one of my areas of interest, is leadership in public health. And there has been some crucial analysis that have been done, a lot of papers. Anyone interested, go to the Leadership Journal, there's a special edition issued in 2020 that has analyzed how various political leaders have approached the containment of COVID, and how that sort of explains how there are different strategies in the approach has actually accounted for the differences in the impact. So there's a thing about leadership, there's a thing about the way health systems are set up in various countries. Okay, so some countries have got more robust healthcare structures. So when they had COVID, these structures were already in place. In terms of leadership, I mean, I'm not going to mention any country because this is very debatable. But some countries took measures very early. Okay, they started the test and trace very quickly. They started locking things down very quickly. Others waited a bit. I mean, it's not to blame and shame anyone, but this is the nature of pandemic. It's like a war zone. You don't know what is next. I don't know whether people remember Y2K. So the year 2000, we all said, there was going to be a computer virus that was going to break all computers. And we panicked. People sold their computers. People did all sort of stuff. And Y2K didn't happen. So similar to pandemics, you never know what will happen. So the approach to it by different leaders are different. The ones that have taken more efficient approaches are the ones that we are seeing that they are having less impact of COVID now, compared to others that perhaps waited a bit late.
Jazakallah, Dr. Sahib. The next question is from Muhammad Luqman Sahib, who asks, is there a link with or between vitamin D deficiencies and COVID?
That's a very interesting one. I haven't explored this evidence in detail. I know there have been some research papers that are sort of explored vitamin D deficiency and COVID. I've not appraised that evidence. I can't draw conclusion on it. But what I will say is that wherever you see this evidence, just a guide to seeing how valid it is. Just know that COVID is impacted by a lot of factors. Always see whether they've controlled for all the other factors. For example, you see that when I was presenting the data on religion, you would have thought being a Muslim just makes you at higher risk of COVID. But it's only because a lot of BAME groups are actually Muslims. And that is why. It's not because the fact that they are Muslims. So for vitamin D, when you're reading any paper that has sort of found a relationship, just look to see whether they've controlled all other factors, especially ethnicity. It's a big risk factor.
Jazakallah. A question from Naveed Sharvani, who asks, how do we increase our immune system? And if I can link that to another question that is linking to what you said earlier on in the lecture about how rates of diabetes, obesity, and blood pressure is higher and more common amongst BAME community members. Is there any specific advice that you can give in terms of how we can better our lifestyle choices?
Yes, absolutely. So if you look at these chronic conditions are conditions that develop over time, okay? And they're accumulation of factors. And these factors range from things such as our diet, okay? The food we eat, how we keep our bodies fit, okay? It's a whole range of factors. In the way we maintain the health of our heart, for example. So, and these conditions develop over time. One of my advice to people, okay, and I can touch on several areas on this, but two key areas, looking at the data from BAME communities is our diet and physical activity. You will see that in most of the diet of, South Asians and Africans, loads of oils, loads of sugars, okay. We eat these over time. All these things have got an impact on our heart, obesity and all that. There's a complex mechanism that explains all these things. But one of the key things that, I'm always interested in is physical activity. Okay, it's physical activity has been very low among BAME groups. Okay, such as exercising. And these are things that if you take for granted, what you end up doing is that because physical activity, let me just say, it improves your immune system, okay? And we've seen from COVID that those who actually had a very good immune system, even when they came into contact of the virus, they were able to survive it. Some were asymptomatic, some developed the sickness, and they just recovered automatically. So my advice is for people to watch their nutrition, okay? Watch what you eat. Watch your physical activity. Try to be more physical activities. more fiscally active. Recently, the Pan-African Ahmadiyya Association launched a scheme, a challenge scheme known as the 10,000 Step Daily Challenge, where every PAMA member was actually challenged to take 10,000 steps a day during this lockdown and during the winter period to get people more active. Build a strong immune system. COVID is just one of the pandemics. We don't know which new one we'll face in future. Okay, we've seen SARS and all the others. So remain physically active, have a good nutrition, take care of your mental well-being. Very, very important, okay? Especially BAME groups. The issue, BAME males, let me be specific. The issue of that masculinity. Yeah, I'm a black man, I am strong, black don't crack. We've seen black cracking in COVID, okay? I'm an Asian man. These modern things don't work on me. We are in a system in the UK where healthcare is free at the point of call. Regular checks up with your GPs. Okay, I'm a big victim. Ask me the last time I saw my GP about 10 years ago, but that is no good. Okay, seek healthcare when you feel you have a problem, because that can just be a beginning to a bigger problem in the future. So lots of advice. There is a leaflet actually. If you type it in about maintaining your hats and just put something BAME in the UK. There is a very good work done by the British Heart Foundation that sort of gives you guidelines as to how to maintain a healthy heart and a healthy body. Advise anyone who wants to know more about these should read those leaflets. Very short, succinct, and very clear in terms of recommendations.
Dr. Sahib, I'm sure you will search for that information and more also. I think you've really educated us and raised awareness about the importance of knowing more about the impact of COVID-19 and the implications that the pandemic has had on the world as a whole. And with your expert insights and also your very valuable advice and guidance, we are very thankful and grateful to you for your time this evening. Jazakallah Jazak. Just to remind viewers that we have our next Urdu lecture next Monday, that is the 1st of February at 8 o'clock. That will be on the topic of Kashti Nu, or Noah's Ark, by Murabbi Silsila Akil Gang Sahib. And Akil Sahib will again be with us on Tuesday as well, that's a week today, to deliver the same lecture in English. So please join us for both of those lectures at 8 o'clock next week. But prior to that, inshallah, this coming Saturday, we have our virtual careers and Taaleem, that's Education Forum, live on both Zoom and YouTube. That's Saturday the 30th of January 2021. More specifically, the Taaleem department will be hosting 3 particular forums, which we invite our viewers to attend on various different areas. So the first forum will be at 2 o'clock on Saturday. That will be entitled the Education in the UK Forum, which will provide valuable information on educational matters from primary age to university. And that particular forum will be in Urdu. The following lecture, or rather I should say forum, will be at 3 o'clock on study skills. This will be looking at vital skills that students should have to support and enhance the learning. They'll be in English. And also on the same day at 4 o'clock, we have our final discussion on motivation matters and how we can, as students, as learners, better organize our ways and approach to learning. So please join us for those panel discussions. We do have an expert panel of guests who will be with us on Saturday, including current students who will also be sharing their advice about how to succeed in their studies, particularly in the light of the lockdown situation. Please join us for that also this Saturday. If I could please hand over to our respected National Secretary Nadeem Rahman Sahib for any final comments.
Jazakallah. I would like to say thank you to you, Vakar Sahib, and Shakil Sahib for another great program. And Dr. Sanda Sahib, Jazakallah for taking your time out and coming and educating us. Really do appreciate it. If I could humbly request you to lead us in silent prayer, that would be a great privilege for us.
Right. Shall we raise our hands in silent prayer? ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. Amen.
Jazakallah and Assalamu alaikum to our dear viewers.